Before we dive into today's hole, I want to ask you a question. And I want you to pause the video and really sit with it. Because this question might change the way you think. Completely. When was the last time you saw something genuinely extreme? And your first thought wasn't, "That's insane," but instead, "Yeah, I've seen worse." I don't mean shocking violence. I don't mean some unhinged rant from a guy yelling in his car. I mean the quiet stuff, the clean stuff, the stuff that looks good, the kind of content that slides past your brain wearing a minimalist font, neutral colors, lo-fi background music, maybe a marble statue avatar, and a caption that sounds vaguely philosophical. Something like, "Strength requires sacrifice," or "Decay is necessary for rebirth." And you don't flinch. You don't even pause. You just scroll. Which is weird, because 10 years ago, if someone said the same thing out loud, in public, without the aesthetic wrapper, you'd have slowly backed away while pretending to check your phone. And that's what this episode is about. Not extremism as shouting. Not extremism as chaos. But extremism as vibe. Because somewhere along the way, radical ideas stopped kicking the door down and started knocking politely, with good lighting. And yeah, I know, this already sounds like one of those "the internet is bad" takes. I promise it's not that lazy. This isn't about blaming TikTok or Instagram or whatever app you deleted and reinstalled 3 times this week. This is about how aesthetics, design, tone, irony, humor have been doing a lot of heavy lifting for ideas that used to live exclusively on the fringes. Ideas that didn't suddenly become more reasonable. They just became more presentable. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. In memes, in fashion, in ironic edits, in motivational language that sounds like self-help, but smells like something darker if you stay with it long enough. And the uncomfortable part? A lot of it doesn't look wrong at first glance. Some of it even looks kind of cool, which is exactly the problem. But first, if this is your first time here, welcome to the rabbit hole. I'm Mo. I talk about weird, uncomfortable, often ignored corners of reality, stuff that actually affects people, not fairy tales or spooky noises in the woods. I don't do jump scare edits. I don't yell at you every 5 seconds. And I'm definitely not here to sell you some fake exclusive footage with a red circle and an arrow pointing at literally nothing. I'm here to give you a different kind of experience, just information, laid out in a way you can actually focus on, process, and understand without distractions pulling you every 2 seconds. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe and join my small family. And before we kick off our trip through, feel free to share what time it is right now and where you're listening from. I won't lie. I'm genuinely curious to know who's tuning in from around the world. And if this isn't your first time down the hole, leave the rabbit symbol in the comments. I'll know. And now, wear your headphones, grab your coffee, or whatever unholy energy drink is slowly killing your brain cells. Flip your phone over, turn off the lights, and focus. And like I always say, every story, even if it sounds the same, never really matches what I'm about to tell you. So, the normalization of extremism through aesthetics. Here's the thing, nobody likes admitting out loud. Most extremist movements didn't fail because their ideas were too extreme. They failed because they looked extreme. Bad visuals, bad messaging, bad vibes. Think about it. For most of the 20th century, radical ideologies announce themselves loudly. Uniforms, symbols, aggressive slogans, ugly propaganda posters that screamed instead of whispered. You didn't accidentally stumble into them. You knew what you were looking at, and your brain did what brains are good at: categorize, label, reject. But modern extremism learned something. Slowly, painfully, mostly by watching marketing departments do their thing. If you strip away the aesthetics, if you remove the fonts, the irony, the memes, the just asking questions tone, a lot of these ideas haven't changed at all. Same beliefs, same end goals, same obsession with hierarchy, purity, collapse, or cleansing. What changed is the delivery. Instead of saying, "We want to dismantle democratic society," you get, "Liberal modernity has failed." Instead of, "Violence is necessary," you get, "History shows that collapse is inevitable." And this part specifically is about accelerationism. By the way, I actually made a full video about it last week, so if you've got some free time and want to understand everything about this rabbit hole, I'll leave a link to the full video in the description box. You'll find all the details there about accelerationism. In short, accelerationism is the belief that society has to collapse before it can be rebuilt. Accelerationist ideology and extremist movements tied to it push people online toward chaos instead of reform. From far-right, pro-accelerationist terrorism to mainstream collapse narratives, this episode exposes how coercive belief systems spread through memes, crises, and online communities, and why fantasies about societal collapse are way more dangerous than they seem. Instead of "outgroups are the problem," you get "some people just don't contribute." And suddenly, it doesn't sound like a manifesto. It sounds like a podcast clip, a clean one, with a nice mic. This shift didn't happen overnight. When people think of extremism, they usually picture something obvious: skinheads in the 90s, grainy VHS tapes, bad lighting, worse haircuts, angry dudes yelling into camcorders about enemies that sound vaguely imaginary. That image is comforting because it makes extremism feel distant, outdated, like something society already dealt with and put in a box labeled handled. But that's not what it looks like anymore. Now, it looks like an Instagram post with soft lighting and a Roman statue profile pic. It looks like a TikTok edit with slowed down anime clips and motivational quotes about discipline and order. It looks like a podcast thumbnail where everyone's wearing black turtlenecks and staring into the middle distance like they're auditioning for a philosophy cologne ad. None of that feels extreme. That's the normalization. Somewhere around the mid-2000s, right when social media platforms decided they were neutral pipes instead of publishers, something shifted. Ideas stopped being judged by what they said and started being judged by how they looked. If it was clean, ironic, detached, self-aware, it slid right past people's defenses. You see it really clearly if you look at meme culture around 2016. Pepe the Frog didn't start as a hate symbol. That's documented. Matt Fury, the guy who drew him, was just making a laid-back stoner comic in the early 2000s. But by the time of the 2016 US election, Pepe had been repurposed, remixed, layered in irony, until you couldn't tell if someone was joking or recruiting. That ambiguity wasn't a bug. It was the whole point. If you call it out, they laugh and say you're overreacting. If you ignore it, it spreads. Either way, it wins. And this wasn't limited to one ideology, one country, or one platform. You saw the same visual language pop up on Fortran boards like /poll/, then bleed into Twitter, then get sanitized for Instagram and TikTok. Hard edges sanded down. Violent rhetoric replaced with just asking questions. Hate swapped for concern. And that's where aesthetics come in. Because aesthetics are emotional shortcuts. They tell your brain how to feel before you think. Think about it. If someone shows you a badly designed website with Comic Sans and a flaming skull GIF, you instinctively don't trust it. Your brain goes, nah, this is probably nonsense. But if the same idea is wrapped in clean typography, muted colors, classical imagery, suddenly it feels serious, thoughtful, legit. That's not accidental. That's design psychology. Corporations have used it forever. Political movements just caught up. Political movements just caught up. By the time of the Christchurch shooting in March 2019, Brenton Tarrant, New Zealand, you could already see this fully formed. His manifesto wasn't written like a traditional extremist screed. It was layered with memes, irony, references meant to confuse journalists and resonate with online subcultures. He live-streamed the attack like it was content, like it was supposed to be consumed. And yeah, I know, bringing that up feels heavy. It should. Because that moment forced a lot of researchers to admit something uncomfortable. Online aesthetics weren't just decoration anymore. They were operational. After that, platforms scrambled. Some symbols got banned. Some phrases got flagged. But banning symbols doesn't kill ideas. It just forces them to evolve visually. You can trace it pretty clearly if you're willing to sit in the discomfort. In the early 2000s, fringe forums, 4chan, later 8chan, started experimenting with irony as camouflage. The idea was simple. If everything is a joke, nothing can be pinned down. If you get called out, you just say, relax, it's satire. That tactic didn't stay in the basement for long. By around 2015, you start seeing explicitly political memes dressed up as absurdist humor. Pepe the Frog didn't start as a symbol. He was just a comic character. But symbolism doesn't need permission. It just needs repetition. And once something is funny, people share it. Once people share it, it spreads. Once it spreads, meaning attaches itself, whether you want it to or not. The memes got cleaner. The jokes got drier. The rage got quieter. The language borrowed from philosophy, from Stoicism, from ancient Rome. Because nothing makes a modern grievance feel timeless like a marble bust and a Latin quote. If you've ever seen an account with a black and white profile picture of Marcus Aurelius posting about strength, decay, and weak men, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And maybe you followed it, or liked a post, or thought, hey, some of this is cringe, but some of it kind of makes sense. That's the funnel. Nobody starts at the bottom. Nobody wakes up and decides, today, I'm going to adopt an extreme worldview. They start with vibes, with feelings, with aesthetics that resonate emotionally before they ever become explicit ideologically. That's not an accident. It's design. In academic terms, researchers like Cynthia Miller Idris have been talking about this for years. Around 2018, she started documenting how extremist movements were embedding themselves in mainstream youth culture through fashion, music, fitness, and lifestyle branding. Not speeches, not rallies, hoodies, playlists, Instagram posts. Because if you can make an idea feel like an identity instead of an argument, you don't have to win debates anymore. You just have to look cool enough to copy. And look, before anyone jumps in the comments yelling, "You're overthinking it." Yeah, of course not. Everyone who reposts a meme is being radicalized. Of course irony exists. Of course people joke. But movements don't need everyone. They need a small percentage of people who don't realize when the jokes stop being a joke. And that line is intentionally blurry. That's the genius part. And yeah, it feels gross calling it genius, but call it what it is. Extremism today doesn't ask you to agree with everything. It asks you to agree with one thing, then another, then another. Always wrapped in language that feels reasonable, detached, even intellectual. No shouting, no urgency. Just calm, aesthetic certainty. And certainty is seductive, especially in a world that feels chaotic, unstable, and unfair. When everything feels like it's falling apart, ideas that frame collapse as necessary start sounding less horrifying and more comforting. Like, oh, this isn't random. This is supposed to happen. That's dangerous territory, because once destruction is framed as inevitable, or worse, desirable, you stop asking who gets hurt along the way. You stop asking who benefits. You stop asking who designed the narrative. And here's where I want you to pause for a second and actually think about your own feed. Not the obvious stuff, the subtle stuff. What ideas keep repeating themselves? What moods? What aesthetics? Drop a comment if you've noticed this shift yourself, especially if it surprised you when you first clocked it. All right, so let's talk about irony for a second. Not the fun kind, not Alanis Morissette irony. I mean weaponized irony. The kind that lets people say absolutely unhinged things and then vanish behind a shrug when you question it. Because irony is the perfect shield. It lets you test ideas in public without committing to them. You float something extreme out there, wrap it in humor, deadpan delivery, or meta commentary, and then you watch what happens. Who laughs? Who shares? Who pushes back? Who stays quiet? And if someone calls it out, relax, bro. It's a joke. Why are you so sensitive? That move, right there, that's not accidental. That's been studied. You can trace it back to online subcultures that realized something really important around the mid-2000s. Sincerity makes you vulnerable. Irony makes you slippery. I talked about this too. You'll find a video about it on the channel. In that video, I explain how these online subcultures create their own version of reality and mess with people's beliefs. I break down how digital extremist groups act, how echo chambers work, and how the illusion of truth effect keeps extreme stories feeling real the more they're repeated. On forums like Forshan, especially /poll, irony became a survival mechanism. Not because everyone was secretly a genius troll, but because saying what you actually believe makes you accountable. Irony lets you deny intent after the fact. It creates plausible deniability. And plausible deniability is oxygen for extreme ideas. Because now, when someone stumbles across a post saying something like, "Democracy was a mistake," it's never presented as a demand. It's presented as a vibe, a thought, a meme with a statue and a sad song underneath it. Maybe even a smirk. You're not supposed to argue with it. You're supposed to feel it. And feelings don't require footnotes. What's wild is how fast this migrated from fringe spaces into mainstream platforms. By the late 2000s, irony-heavy political content wasn't just living in anonymous forums anymore. It was on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, places where context collapses and everything is flattened into a scroll. And here's where aesthetics really start doing their dirty work. Because when you remove context, all you have left is tone and visuals. And tone can carry ideology without ever naming it. A black and white edit of collapsing cities. A quote about hard times creating strong men. A moody soundtrack. No explicit call to action. No mention of policy. No named enemy. Just implication. And implication is powerful because it lets the viewer complete the thought themselves. Your brain fills in the blanks using whatever frustrations, fears, or grievances you already have. The content doesn't radicalize you directly. It resonates with something that's already there. That's the part nobody likes admitting. Extremism doesn't usually introduce new emotions. It repackages existing ones. Alienation, anger, disorientation, loneliness, a sense that the rules are rigged and nobody's being honest about it. Sound familiar? Yeah, because that's also the default emotional state of the internet right now. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, but this still feels abstract, let's ground it. Around 2019, researchers started noticing something interesting in far-right online spaces. Not just growth, but aesthetic convergence. Accounts that had nothing to do with politics on the surface. Fitness pages, quote accounts, stoic mindset pages were slowly overlapping with ideological content. Same fonts, same color palettes, same language. Words like discipline, order, degeneracy, decay. Words that sound neutral until you notice how consistently they point in one direction. And the genius, again, gross word, but accurate, is that none of this requires saying the quiet part out loud. The audience self-selects. If the message doesn't resonate with you, you scroll past. If it does, you linger. Maybe follow. Maybe like. Maybe your algorithm takes a note. And now, you're in a slightly different neighborhood. That's not paranoia. That's literally how recommendation systems work. They don't care about truth. They care about engagement. And controversial but aesthetic content is engagement gold. It provokes without triggering moderation systems. It spreads without naming targets explicitly. Which brings us to the next evolution, normalization. Once an idea becomes familiar, it becomes less shocking. Once it's less shocking, it becomes discussable. Once it's discussable, it becomes debatable. And once it's debatable, it's no longer taboo. That's the ladder. You don't climb it all at once. You're carried up it by repetition. Think about phrases that would have been radioactive 10 years ago that now just exist in conversation. Collapse, degeneracy, cultural rot, the West. These aren't neutral descriptors. They're loaded terms with histories attached to them. But aesthetics strip away that history and present the words as observations instead of accusations. It's the difference between saying, "This group is the problem," and saying, "Something feels wrong, doesn't it?" One sounds like an argument, the other sounds like intuition, and people trust their intuition way more than they trust strangers. This isn't about saying aesthetics are evil. Art isn't the enemy. Style isn't the enemy. Humor isn't the enemy. The problem is asymmetry. When complex, extreme ideas are simplified into digestible aesthetic fragments, they lose friction. There's no resistance, no pause, no demand that you actually understand the consequences of what's being implied. It's all vibes, no responsibility. And the internet loves that, especially platforms that reward emotional spikes. Anger, fear, nostalgia, superiority. All emotions that extremist narratives tap into effortlessly. And once those emotions are normalized, once they're part of the aesthetic landscape, you stop noticing how often they show up. You just feel them. Let me ask you something, honestly. Have you ever watched a video or scrolled past a post that made you feel oddly validated in your frustration without actually giving you any new information? Yeah, that's effective persuasion, convincing you emotionally before you ever engage intellectually. And it works best when it doesn't feel like persuasion at all. That's why modern extremist aesthetics avoid urgency. No act now. No rise up. Those are red flags. Instead, you get calm certainty, detached commentary, the vibe of someone who's already figured it out and is just observing the mess from above. That posture, detachment, is seductive. It makes you feel smarter for agreeing, like you're seeing through the illusion while everyone else is still trapped in it. And once that identity forms, once you start seeing yourself as someone who gets it, it becomes really hard to question the underlying assumptions without feeling like you're betraying your own intelligence. That's how belief systems lock in, not through fear alone, through belonging. And when it comes to belonging, I talked about that last week too. Sorry if I'm bringing up a lot of topics today, but trust me, when it comes to extremism, all of these topics are deeply connected and overlap a lot. You'll find a video on the channel that focuses on belonging and asks the question, why do people join dangerous groups? In that video, I break down the psychology of belonging, why people end up joining dangerous groups, extremist movements, and cult-like communities. I also analyze how social isolation, identity, and psychological conditioning all play a role in pushing people toward extremism, both online and in the real world. And this is where the aesthetics stop being just visuals and start becoming social signals. Certain memes, certain phrases, certain ironic detachment styles act like dog whistles. Not in the cartoon villain sense, but in the if you know sense. They tell others like you, you're not alone. And they tell outsiders, this space isn't for you. That separation matters. Because once discourse becomes tribal, truth becomes secondary. What matters is coherence within the group. Does this idea feel right? Does it align with the aesthetic? Does it reinforce the shared mood? If yes, it spreads. If not, it's ignored or mocked. And mockery is another incredibly effective gatekeeping tool. If questioning something gets you labeled as NPC, normie, or brainwashed, most people will stop questioning publicly. Not because they're convinced, but because social pain is real. Silence looks like agreement from the outside. And agreement, even passive, normalizes. So here's the uncomfortable part I want you to sit with. You don't have to comment. You don't have to like. Just think. How many ideas in your feed feel familiar now that once would have sounded extreme if spoken plainly? How many vibes have you absorbed without ever consciously choosing them? That's not an accusation. That's a reality of living inside algorithmic culture. And yeah, before anyone says it, this cuts across ideologies. Different extremes use different aesthetics. Some go for chaos. Some go for purity. Some go for humor. Some go for serenity. Same mechanism, different skin. But the end result is the same. Ideas bypass scrutiny by entering through emotion. But the end result is the same. Ideas bypass scrutiny by entering through emotion. And if any of this is hitting a little too close to home, yeah, same. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you're landing on this. All right, now we need to talk about something that looks harmless, even healthy. Something that, on the surface, feels like the opposite of extremism. Self-improvement. Yeah, I know. That probably triggered at least one eye roll. Stick with me. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be stronger, more disciplined, more focused. That's not the issue. The issue is how those concepts got quietly rewired into moral hierarchies and then aestheticized to hell and back. Somewhere around the late 2000s, self-improvement content exploded. Gym clips, cold showers, wake up at 4 a.m. routines, stoic quotes, minimalist aesthetics, black coffee, black and white visuals, no smiling, ever. Smiling is weakness, apparently. And again, none of this is inherently bad. But watch what happens when language shifts just a little. Discipline stops meaning consistency and starts meaning worth. Strength stops meaning resilience and starts meaning dominance. Weakness stops being something human and starts being something contemptible. And suddenly, self-improvement isn't about growth. It's about separation. Who's disciplined and who's lazy? Who's strong and who's degenerate? Who deserves respect and who deserves, well, whatever happens to them. And you'll notice something weird if you stay in these spaces long enough. Failure is never contextual. There's no room for structural problems. No talk of economics, health, trauma, or randomness. Everything is framed as a personal moral failing. If you're struggling, it's because you didn't grind hard enough. If society's unstable, it's because people got soft. If things are collapsing, it's because weakness was tolerated. That framing does a lot of ideological work without ever announcing itself. Because once you accept that worldview, solutions start sounding harsher. And harsher solutions don't feel cruel if you believe they're necessary. Or worse, natural. This is where Stoicism gets dragged into the mess. Actual Stoic philosophy, like the real stuff from Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, is about managing your internal reactions to things you can't control. It's about humility, about accepting limits, about not confusing power with virtue. But that's not what gets shared. What gets shared are fragments, quotes ripped out of context and slapped onto statues. Endure, be hard, don't complain. Reduced to vibes that feel ancient and authoritative, because nothing says this is timeless truth like a dead Roman. And slowly, Stoicism stops being about emotional regulation and starts being about emotional suppression. Vulnerability becomes suspect. Compassion becomes softness. Softness becomes decay. By the time someone explicitly says something extreme, the groundwork has already been laid emotionally. The audience has been primed to see empathy as weakness and hierarchy as natural. And the wild part? A lot of people don't even realize they've absorbed any of this. Because it didn't come as ideology. It came as lifestyle content, workout clips, motivation edits, get your life together reels. And here's the thing that makes this especially effective. It preys on people who already feel behind. People who feel like the world's moving without them. People who want control, order, meaning. Collapse narratives slide in perfectly here, because if you feel powerless, the idea that everything is collapsing anyway can feel relieving. Like, oh, it's not just me, the system is broken. And then that idea takes another step. Maybe collapse isn't just inevitable. Maybe it's good. Maybe it clears out weakness. Maybe it resets the board. That's a very old idea, by the way. You can find versions of it in early 20th century political movements that didn't end well for anyone involved. Back then, it was framed through blood and soil. Now it's framed through algorithms and aesthetic despair. Same bones, new skin. By the early 2000s, accelerationist language, ideas about speeding up societal collapse, started appearing outside explicitly extremist spaces. Not labeled, not explained, just implied. Posts about letting it burn, jokes about no future, detached commentary about how democracy is inefficient, outdated, or weak. Again, no call to action, just vibes. And vibes don't get moderated. That's another key piece here. Platforms are built to flag explicit content, slurs, threats, named targets. But implication, mood, aesthetic nihilism, that stuff slides right through. So you get a feedback loop. Content that feels dark, intelligent, and resigned performs well. It gets shared. It gets copied. And soon, the aesthetic becomes familiar, comfortable even. And familiarity breeds normalization. This is where we need to talk about the audience side of this, because it's easy to paint this as some evil mastermind situation. It's not that clean. A lot of people sharing this content genuinely don't see themselves as extreme. They see themselves as realists, as people who aren't buying the lies anymore. And that self-image matters, because extremism today doesn't recruit by saying, join us. It recruits by saying, you already know this. It flatters you. It says, you're not like the others. You see the pattern. You're awake. And if you've ever felt dismissed, ignored, or condescended to by mainstream narratives, yeah, that hits hard. That's why mockery is such a powerful tool in these spaces. Calling people sheep or NPCs isn't just an insult, it's a boundary. It separates those who see from those who don't. And once that boundary exists, persuasion becomes unnecessary. The group reinforces itself. Here's where I want to pause and ask you something, and actually sit with it. Have you ever found yourself agreeing with something, mainly because the person saying it seemed confident, calm, and detached, not because they actually backed it up? That's aesthetic authority, confidence without accountability. And it works because humans are pattern recognition machines. We associate calm delivery and clean presentation with competence. We do it instinctively. That's not a moral failing, it's wiring. But that wiring can be exploited, and it is, constantly. Especially when content creators position themselves as observers rather than advocates. I'm not saying this is good or bad, I'm just pointing it out. That move, that's huge, because it lets extreme ideas circulate without ownership. Nobody's responsible. Nobody's endorsing anything. They're just noticing. And notice how often that posture comes with a kind of smug detachment, like being emotionally invested is beneath them, like caring is cringe. That's not neutrality. That's a stance. And it's a stance that pairs beautifully with extremism because it discourages moral engagement. If everything is just observation, then nothing demands a response. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a culture where ideas don't need to be defended. They just need to feel right. Where aesthetics do the persuasion, and logic shows up later, if at all. And look, I'm not saying every Stoic quote account is a pipeline. I'm not saying fitness influencers are secretly plotting societal collapse. That's lazy thinking. What I am saying is that certain emotional and aesthetic patterns make people more receptive to extreme conclusions, especially when those conclusions are framed as inevitable, natural, or deserved. And when you combine that with algorithms that reward engagement over truth, yeah, things drift. Slowly, quietly. That's the scariest part. There's no moment where you can point and say, that's where it happened. No dramatic turn, just gradual normalization. And once something's normal, questioning it feels awkward, like you missed a meeting everyone else attended. If you've been nodding along, or if you've been uncomfortable, that's fine. Both reactions make sense. Drop a comment if any of this connects to stuff you've seen or felt. Seriously, I want to know how this looks from your side of the screen. We need to talk about the past, or more accurately, a version of the past. A carefully curated, aggressively filtered, aesthetically pleasing past that never actually existed the way it's being presented. History aesthetics. You've seen it. You might not even register it consciously anymore. Ancient statues, Roman legions, medieval castles, Crusader imagery, Spartan helmets, grainy black and white photos of men staring into the distance like they're about to invent discipline itself. And layered over all of that, quotes, half quotes, misquotes, stuff that sounds ancient enough that nobody bothers checking it. What's happening here is subtle, but it's doing a ton of work. Because when you wrap a modern grievance in ancient imagery, it feels timeless, legitimate, inevitable. Like you're not reacting emotionally to the present. You're simply recognizing a pattern that's always existed. That's the pitch. The cycle of civilizations. Hard times create strong men. Empires rise and fall. Now, quick reality check. Historians have been tearing that hard times/strong men quote apart for years. It's not an ancient saying. It's not from Rome. It's not from Greece. It comes from a 1947 novel by G. Michael Hopf, modern fiction. But slap it over a marble bust, and suddenly it feels like wisdom carved into stone. And that's the trick. History becomes a costume. Because real history is messy, contradictory, uncomfortable, full of cooperation, compromise, and boring administrative stuff that doesn't look cool in a montage. But aesthetic history, that's clean, masculine, hierarchical, violent in a way that feels purposeful instead of horrifying. You don't see famine. You don't see disease. You don't see women, children, slaves, or the people crushed by those strong men. You see order. You see power. You see clarity. And clarity is addictive when the present feels confusing. This isn't new, by the way. Early 20th century extremist movements did the same thing. They obsessed over mythologized pasts, golden ages that conveniently excluded anyone they didn't like. They cherry-picked symbols and stories, stripped them of context, and used them to justify modern agendas. The difference now is speed and scale. You don't need a propaganda ministry anymore. You need an Instagram account with good taste. And the accounts pushing this stuff rarely say what they mean outright. They don't have to. The aesthetic does the talking. Rome equals order. Decay equals modernity. Strength equals hierarchy. Weakness equals democracy. Pluralism, empathy. Pick your poison. And because none of this is stated explicitly, it feels like interpretation rather than indoctrination. You're not being told what to think. You're being nudged toward what to feel. That's a huge distinction. Because feelings don't trigger your critical defenses the same way arguments do. You don't argue with a mood. You absorb it. And over time, that mood becomes a lens. Everything you see passes through it. Modern society, decadent, complex problems, symptoms of decline, people asking for inclusion or reform, signs of weakness. Again, notice how little evidence is required here. It's narrative logic, not factual logic. The past was strong, the present is weak. Therefore, something must be restored or destroyed. And if you already feel alienated, frustrated, or disoriented, that story fits a little too well. Here's where nostalgia comes in. Nostalgia isn't about accuracy, it's about emotional safety. It's the feeling that there was once a time when things made sense, when roles were clear, hierarchies were stable, and the world didn't ask so many uncomfortable questions. Except that time never existed universally. It existed for some people, and usually at the expense of others. But aesthetics erase that part. When you see a romanticized past, you're not seeing who was excluded. You're seeing who was centered. And if you identify with that center, even subconsciously, you feel like something was taken from you. That sense of loss is powerful, and it doesn't take much for that loss to turn into resentment. This is where extremist narratives quietly latch on. They don't say, you should hate these people. They say, look what was lost. And your brain fills in the rest. Who took it? Who ruined it? Who doesn't belong in this story? That's how the past becomes a weapon against the present. And again, this doesn't require belief in anything extreme up front. You can just enjoy the aesthetics, the quotes, the imagery, the feeling of connection to something bigger and older than yourself. But repetition matters. If the only version of history you consume frames hierarchy as natural, collapse as cyclical, and compassion as weakness, those ideas stop feeling controversial. They feel obvious, like common sense. That's normalization. And normalization doesn't announce itself. It creeps. Let me throw something at you. Think about how often you've seen ancient Rome used as shorthand online. Rome didn't fall because people got soft. It collapsed over centuries due to economic strain, overexpansion, political corruption, internal power struggles, and constant civil war. It was complicated, boring, bureaucratic, but none of that fits the aesthetic. So instead, Rome becomes a moral lesson, a cautionary tale, a meme. And memes don't care about nuance. They care about shareability. Now let's layer in another element: selective historical realism. You'll notice these spaces love saying things like, "That's just how humans are," or "This has always been the case." It's an appeal to nature, to inevitability, to biology. And it's comforting, because if something is natural, you don't have to feel bad about it. Hierarchy? Natural. Conflict? Natural. Suffering? Unavoidable. And if suffering is unavoidable, then why bother trying to reduce it? Because once cruelty is reframed as realism, empathy starts looking naive. Efforts to change systems look futile, and people advocating for them look delusional, or worse, manipulative. That's when cynicism turns into moral disengagement. And moral disengagement is the last stop before people stop caring who gets hurt. I want to be really clear here, because nuance matters. Studying history doesn't make you extreme. Liking ancient aesthetics doesn't make you dangerous. Wanting structure doesn't make you a villain. The issue is when aesthetics replace analysis, when mood replaces evidence, when feeling right replaces being right. And when that happens, history stops being something you learn from and starts being something you use. And used history always serves someone. So ask yourself, who benefits from a narrative where collapse is inevitable, where hierarchy is natural, where empathy is weakness? Because it's never neutral. Because platforms love this stuff. History aesthetics perform insanely well. They're visually striking. They feel intellectual. They trigger nostalgia and superiority at the same time. And they're vague enough to avoid moderation. So the algorithm keeps feeding it to people who engage, even casually, even skeptically. You watch one edit, then another. Then suddenly your feed is full of marble statues judging modernity. And maybe you don't agree with all of it, but it's familiar now. And familiar feels safe. That's how the window shifts. This is the point where I want you to stop and check yourself, not with guilt, but with awareness. What version of the past feels comforting to you? What stories about history make you feel validated rather than challenged? Those answers don't make you bad. They make you human. But they do tell you where you might be vulnerable to narratives that aren't trying to educate you. They're trying to recruit your emotions. And yeah, recruit is the right word. Even if nobody ever asks you to do anything. Because belief precedes action. Always. All right. Ideas don't really become dangerous until they stop being ideas and start becoming identity. Up until now, everything we've talked about can still sit comfortably in the realm of content. Stuff you watch, stuff you scroll past, stuff you half agree with and half ignore. But identity doesn't live in the scroll. Identity lives in how you see yourself in relation to everyone else. And modern extremism? It understands identity better than almost anyone. Here's the move. It doesn't say, believe this doctrine. It says, this is who you are. Or more accurately, this is who you aren't. And that's the problem. You're not like them. You're not fooled. You're not weak. You're not blind. You're aware. You're disciplined. You see the decay. And once you accept that framing, you don't just hold an opinion. You hold a position. This is why so much of this content leans into the language of awakening. Red-pilled. Seeing the truth. Breaking the illusion. It's not subtle. It's telling you that disagreement doesn't come from a difference in values. It comes from ignorance or manipulation, which is incredibly convenient. Because if people who disagree with you are just asleep, brainwashed, or NPCs, you don't have to engage with them. You don't have to listen. You definitely don't have to empathize. And empathy is the real threat here. Once empathy is framed as weakness, or worse, as a tool used by them to control you, then detachment becomes a virtue. Coldness becomes clarity. Emotional distance becomes intelligence. That's a powerful identity to step into, especially if you felt dismissed or condescended to before. And here's the thing, nobody likes admitting. This identity doesn't feel hateful at first. It feels protective, like you're putting armor on, like you're finally drawing a boundary between yourself and a world that feels chaotic and hostile. You're not angry, you're just done. You're not cruel, you're just realistic. You're not extreme, you're just honest. That's the internal narrative. And once that narrative settles in, questioning it feels like self-betrayal. This is where community comes in, because identity doesn't solidify in isolation. It needs mirrors. It needs reinforcement. It needs other people nodding along, liking, sharing, commenting, posting the same memes with slightly different captions. Online spaces are perfect for this. You don't need deep relationships. You just need signals, shared language, shared jokes, shared contempt. And contempt is bonding glue. Mocking outsiders together creates cohesion inside. That's why ridicule is everywhere in these spaces. Not just directed outward, but inward too. Step out of line, show too much empathy, ask the wrong question, and suddenly you're the cringe one. Social pressure doesn't need rules. It needs vibes. And the vibe here is, don't be soft. So people adapt. They perform detachment. They downplay doubt. They lean into irony even harder. Because irony gives you cover if you're not fully sure yet. But over time, performance turns into habit. Habit turns into belief. And belief turns into worldview. Now, this is where I want to slow down again, because this part matters more than anything else. Most people who slide into these identity frameworks don't think they've joined anything. They don't feel recruited. They feel like they've arrived somewhere, like they finally found language for feelings they already had. That's why arguing facts rarely works once identity is involved. Because you're not challenging an idea. You're challenging a self-concept. You're basically saying, what if the thing that makes you feel grounded is built on a distorted frame? That's not a debate. That's an existential threat. And extremist aesthetics are very, very good at protecting identity from that threat. They pre-frame criticism as proof. If someone pushes back, that just confirms how blind or hostile the outside world is. It's a closed loop. This is also why you'll notice how often these spaces talk about men, masculinity, and strength in very rigid ways. Identity needs boundaries, and gender, especially masculine identity, becomes a convenient anchor in times of uncertainty. If the world feels unstable, defining yourself as strong, in contrast to a weak society, gives you a sense of order. But that order comes at a cost, because once strength is defined narrowly, everything outside it becomes suspect. Emotional openness, cooperation, care, complexity. And once those things are dismissed, the solutions left on the table start skewing. Authoritarian, not always politically at first, sometimes psychologically, sometimes socially, sometimes just in how you talk about people who don't fit the mold. And language matters, because language shapes how we justify harm. If someone is weak, what do they deserve? If a group is degenerate, what should happen to them? If collapse is inevitable, why protect anyone? Notice how the answers start writing themselves once the frame is set. And the scariest part? None of this requires explicit hate. You can arrive at some very dark conclusions while telling yourself You're just being honest about reality. That's how normalization completes itself. The idea doesn't shock you anymore. The language doesn't bother you anymore. The implications don't feel urgent anymore. They feel logical. That's when the line disappears. I want to check in with you right now, not as a narrator, not as some guy talking into a mic, but just human to human. If you've ever felt pulled toward content that made you feel clearer, colder, more certain, but also more detached from other people, that's not random. That's not you being broken. That's a system doing what it's optimized to do. And no, the answer isn't to touch grass or delete everything and live in the woods. That's another aesthetic fantasy. The real defense here is awareness. Being able to step back and ask, what is this content asking me to feel about myself and about others? Because once you see that, the spell weakens. Not instantly, not dramatically, but enough to create friction again. And friction is good. Friction slows things down. It gives you time to think. And if you're still here, seriously, respect. This isn't easy content to sit with. Drop a comment if any of this hit a nerve, or if you caught yourself in any part of it. No judgment. That's kind of the point. All right, this is the part where irony stops being funny. Because sooner or later, this stuff leaves the screen. Not dramatically. Not with some big, obvious moment where a person goes, "Ah, yes, today I activate my extremist arc." It's quieter than that. Boring, even. It leaks into how people talk, how they vote, how they treat others, what they excuse, what they stop pushing back on. That's the real consequence of normalization. Not radicalization as spectacle, but radicalization as posture. You start seeing it when people talk about real suffering with this weird emotional flatness, like they're narrating a documentary about animals instead of talking about human beings. Someone loses their job, their home, their rights, and the response isn't outrage or compassion. It's analysis, shrugs. That's just how it is. You start seeing it when cruelty gets reframed as honesty, when indifference gets reframed as realism, when harm gets reframed as inevitability. And if you zoom out a little, you can see how online aesthetics quietly bleed into real-world decisions. Policies don't come out of nowhere. Neither do social attitudes. They're built on narratives that feel reasonable enough to justify action or inaction. If society is decaying, why invest in it? If collapse is coming anyway, why protect the vulnerable? If hierarchy is natural, why resist it? Those questions don't stay hypothetical forever. And what makes this especially dangerous is how calm it all sounds. No panic, no rage, just certainty. Detached, aesthetic certainty. That's how people talk themselves into accepting things they would have rejected instinctively before. This is where irony breaks. Because irony only works when there are boundaries. When there's still a shared understanding of what's unacceptable. But once the unacceptable becomes familiar, once it's dressed up, memed, aestheticized, irony loses its teeth. The joke stops being a joke. The vibe stops being playful. And suddenly people are saying the same things, but without the wink. That transition is almost impossible to spot from the inside, especially if you've built an identity around seeing things clearly. Because at that point, questioning the direction feels like regression, like weakness, like falling back asleep. So people double down. They get colder, more dismissive, more convinced that empathy is the problem, that nuance is a distraction, that compassion is a luxury we can't afford. And that's how aesthetics quietly train moral disengagement. You don't have to hate anyone explicitly. You just have to stop caring what happens to them. That's enough. History is full of moments where that exact posture paved the way for horrific outcomes. Not because everyone was evil, but because enough people were detached. And yeah, before anyone says it, this doesn't mean everyone watching a moody edit is one step away from doing something awful. That's not how this works. It's about probabilities, not certainties. About environments, not individuals. But environments shape behavior. And we're living in an environment where aestheticized detachment is rewarded. Likes, shares, clout, validation. Caring is messy. Caring requires context. Caring requires uncertainty. Detachment is clean. It's efficient. It looks smart. Algorithms love smart-looking content. So here we are. Now, here's the part I didn't want to turn into some cheesy, and the solution is love ending, because that's not helpful. And honestly, it's kind of insulting. So let's be real. What actually helps isn't rejecting aesthetics or pretending we can reason our way out of emotional influence. Humans don't work like that. What helps is friction. Friction slows things down. It interrupts the smooth slide from vibe to belief to identity. Friction looks like asking one extra question before agreeing. It looks like checking where a quote actually came from. It looks like noticing when something makes you feel superior rather than informed. Friction is uncomfortable, which is why platforms don't optimize for it. But you can. Another thing that helps, this is going to sound boring, but stick with me, is exposure to real complexity, not performative complexity. Not both sides are bad, laziness. Real, annoying, human complexity. Actually listening to people who don't fit neatly into aesthetic categories. People who ruin the narrative by existing. Because aesthetics thrive on simplification. Real humans don't. And yeah, that takes effort, which is why it's easier to retreat into detached observation and call it realism. But realism without responsibility is just nihilism in a suit. And nihilism is not neutral. It always ends up serving someone. One more thing, and this might be the most important, pay attention to how content makes you feel about yourself. Does it make you feel curious or superior? Does it make you feel connected or isolated but special? Does it encourage thinking or discourage caring? Those emotional cues tell you more about the intent than the words ever will. And if something consistently pulls you toward contempt for others or for yourself, that's a red flag, no matter how good the font is. Look, I'm not saying you should live in constant self-policing mode. That's exhausting. And ironically, that kind of hypervigilance can become its own aesthetic trap. This is about awareness, not purity. Being able to say, yeah, this looks cool, but I'm not going to outsource my values to a vibe. Because once you keep your values anchored in actual human consequences, a lot of extremist aesthetics lose their appeal. They start looking hollow, repetitive, performative. The spell breaks, not because you were convinced, but because you saw the mechanism. And mechanisms are less scary once you understand them. That's kind of the theme of this whole channel, honestly. Not exposing secrets, not pretending there's one hidden truth everyone else is missing. Just slowing things down enough to see how influence actually works. Quietly, indirectly, through feelings we don't always notice. If you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you. This isn't passive content. This asks something of you. And the fact that you stayed means you're willing to sit with discomfort instead of outsourcing your thinking. That matters. If this episode reshaped how you see certain content, even a little, drop a comment. Not to agree with me, just to say what you noticed, what shifted, what stuck. And yeah, if you want more of this kind of deep dive, you know what to do. Subscribe, stick around. The hole goes way deeper than this. Same place, same voice, different descent. Until next time, stay curious and don't let aesthetics do your thinking for you.